Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Thank you, everybody. What a great size of a crowd. I appreciate everybody showing up. I usually keep these pretty casual. I've done a number of talks, and I always find that the questions from people are what's kind of drives things and keeps me interested as well as you guys. So I'll talk a little bit about why I wrote this and sort of my thinking behind it, and then we can kind of go from there. I'll do a little reading and give you a taste for the book, and then we can take questions. I guess, first of all, again, I appreciate the introduction. You may have seen me. I work on Capitol News 9, and that's really where I came to work on this case. This is one of the more interesting cases that certainly I've ever followed, and I'm sure that most people have ever heard about, obviously making national news, the local news, covering it extensively. I covered it essentially from, going back. I wasn't here for day one when this whole thing happened, but certainly picked it up for the trial and became sort of learned my legal ways with this case, because there were so many interesting ideas legally just about this case. And that's one of the focuses of this book, I think, is it's almost, and not to make it sound dry right off the bat, but it's sort of a legal look too at some of the very interesting issues that were brought up by this really bizarre situation that arose from this brutal crime. I followed it, and I did not set out to write it. I didn't want to write a book. I have enough time. I was actually getting married while I was covering this trial, so I was very busy, and this was the furthest thing from my mind. But as it progressed, I realized that I was perhaps the only one, the only reporter who was basically in the perfect spot to write this, because I'd covered it day after day after day. I lived in Goshen where the trial took place for, gosh, that would have been 2-3 months. And so a number of reporters had since quit after covering this case, and I realized if some of the more interesting ideas of this case weren't put into a book form, many people wouldn't really understand it, I didn't think, because I was constantly getting questions about it. And one of the times when I realized that I really had to write this was actually when I was getting married in the middle of this trial. My wife is wonderful and put up with that. And I was down in the basement of a church on the weekend, and the next day I had to go back to the trial. And the pastor came over to me and said, "Steve, I just have one question for you." And I'm getting all nervous. I can hear, "Oh, she's arrived. I'm waiting for my wife, to go and do this thing." And she says, "I have one question for you." "What, Pastor? What? You put me at ease here." And the pastor said, "Did he do it?" And that's when I thought, all right, maybe I need to write this. And I've gotten so many questions. People on the street, family members, friends, still talk about this all the time. And that's one reason I wanted to cover it. Not to sensationalize it, because I think there's the risk of that. And people have always asked, well, why did you write it, is one of the questions I get, and that's why I'm trying to answer that question right off the bat. Because I think a lot of people worry, well, are you just trying to take advantage of this poor family? And I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, you can judge, but that is not the case. And I've worked extensively with a number of people in the family, especially through the trial. And, the sister of Peter Porco, even, I sat with her during the trial. And there were a number of instances where, we need the real story to get out, but in the proper way. And that's what I tried to do here, and basically present the facts. This is a book that's written that allows you to decide. It doesn't say whether he's guilty, whether he's not guilty, who did it, anything like that. It allows you to basically look and play detective, which is kind of one of the more interesting things. I've had calls from all across the country after reading this book, from Marines in South Carolina who have read this, to friends out in California, to somebody in I think it was Missouri, who I'd never met, who found my email address somehow, and just went on and on about how this Christopher Porco had to be the guiltiest person ever. And then some of the Marines down in South Carolina told me there's no way they could have convicted him. This guy was innocent. So it's really interesting getting that feedback, and I feel good about that. Obviously, I'll let you all judge, and you guys get to be the final judge on this piece of work. It took me about a year to write this book. And so to anyone who is perhaps writing their own book right now, because there's always a few of you in these crowds that I talk to, I urge you to just really keep at it, because it's a lot of work, a lot of effort, and I think in the end, at least you hope it's worth it. And it allows you to have some greater dialogues like this. So that's sort of some background about me, why I wrote it, and all of that. I think one of the more interesting parts of this trial, again, was really the legal aspects of it. The questions of, there was Joan Porco, who at first sort of, at least according to the detective, said, "Christopher Porco, he did it." She sort of pointed and nodded, saying that, yes, my son was responsible for this. Then, of course, she went into a coma as she was treated, and then came out of it saying, no, he couldn't have done it. She stood by him. And it was the most bizarre thing to see her walking side by side with him into the courthouse in support of her son. And so, of course, all these issues that come up that, well, then should she testify? How does someone like that testify? How do you take that into account? A lot of issues that we get to in here. I should ask, is anybody not familiar with this case maybe? And maybe I should back up. I should. Okay, that's what I figured. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I guess, what I can do is do just a quick little reading, and then we can take some questions, because I always find that I can ramble on here forever. I'm basically paid to do that at my job and on TV sometimes, so I could talk forever, but I find that the questions are much more interesting. So we can do that, and I'll just kind of read some of the first pages, and I'm sure we'll get to some better topics with your questions. Later, everyone in Judge Cardona's office would realize that it was too quiet. For now, morning chatter and the movement of papers kept the gears of justice moving in each room. The New York State Appellate Division Office in downtown Albany, New York, handles cases ranging from burglaries to murders. It also includes civil cases, from unemployment to family issues that are often serious disputes. Ask anyone in the courthouse, and they'd probably tell you it's the cases involving those emotional family issues that can be the most difficult and draining. Peter Porco would know. For years, the middle-aged law clerk had worked on such cases. At least once, Peter had received a threat against his family as a result of his work, a threat serious enough to warrant a police checkup, as his two young boys, Jonathan and Christopher, were whisked away from school. If that event was traumatic for the boys, it was likely even more so for their mother, Joan. The elegant woman had an air of intelligence, of confidence about her. She took pride in her family of protecting her boys and tried to keep surprises at bay through organization and planning. She attended daily mass. A police report would later state that she was, quote, very straight to the point of being stiff. Though when she spoke with you, her soft eyes would usually only hint at kindness. Nothing ever came of the threat that forced their children to be taken out of school. After all, it had happened years ago when both Jonathan and Christopher were still boys, but they had grown up. After high school, Jonathan had graduated ROTC and left for nuclear submarine training. Christopher had taken the typical college route, enjoying the full spoils of life at Rochester University. According to college officials, he rarely attended classes. The threat wasn't the last the family would face. Living in Delmar, a small suburb of Albany, the Porco family could have lived a quiet life in the large but unassuming Colonial. They kept their yard well-groomed, just like the others on the street. In fact, both Peter and Joan had just raked the leaves that had fallen around their Broccoli Drive home. The house certainly didn't stick out among the others, but police had visited it before to look into several burglaries. They had never made an arrest. "Have you seen Peter?" one of Cardona's law clerks asked. Peter occasionally worked at home, but that didn't preclude the question from being asked. Many Albany attorneys, judges, and law clerks knew him not only as a competent worker, but also as a gentle, caring man with whom you could share a laugh. One coworker would later say Peter was the kind of guy you felt comfortable being around. If you asked how his family was doing, you already knew he wanted to know even more about yours. In fact, no one in the office had seen Peter, but that wasn't surprising. Yesterday, he had made 2 phone calls to his boss, Judge Cardona, as he worked from home. But today, there were no phone calls yet, and that was unusual. In the law business, there's always the small chance someone might let discontent with their case coalesce into the more sinister act of violence. That chance, hanging ever present over any legal worker, was enough to be cautious, though it certainly was no reason to panic. By 10:30 in the morning, there had still been no phone call. It was time to put any concerns to rest. The Porco's phone rang without anyone picking up. Now those concerns seemed a little more justified. Enough concern for one of the secretaries to offer to drive over and find out what was going on. Worries grew. Cardona and the security team dismissed the idea of her leaving alone and came down on the side of caution. They decided to send Court Officer Michael Hart. He was armed and knew the protocol in case something had happened. There was a logical explanation for almost everything, even if no one had heard from Peter. The uniformed court officer from the New York State Office of Court Administration nodded his head when the judge asked if he would go. He immediately left the courthouse, jumped in his car, and traveled through the downtown Albany traffic, finding fewer cars on the winding country roads 20 minutes away in Delmar. As the court officer slowed to a stop outside the Porco's home, nothing seemed out of place. He tried the Porco's home phone one more time from his cell phone before getting out. Nothing. He closed the car door, by far the loudest sound in the quiet neighborhood. The sun heated the cool November air as Hart walked up the paved driveway. Suddenly, he stopped. A key with 2 or 3 rubber bands tied around the end sat in the front door lock. His suspicions grew. His heart began to beat a little faster. "Peter?" he asked through the closed door as he knocked loudly. No one answered. His hand gripped the knob with the key still in it, and he noticed a red streak on the doorknob. 2 or 3 drops of blood spotted the cement steps where he stood. Officer Hart thought a second and walked to the garage door to see if it had been left open as well. It was locked. He used his Nextel to instantly connect to his boss, Chief Costello. "You want me to go into the home?" he asked. The phone chirped back. Costello said he could, but warned him to be careful. Hart heard the Porco's old golden retriever barking from inside as he called Costello on the cell to keep each other on the line. He clicked on the speaker function so they could talk easily. Hart decided to go in. He took a breath and turned the front doorknob slowly. He pushed the door open, then stopped in his tracks. He tried to comprehend what he saw. In front of him, a large bifold closet door coated with blood had been ripped from where it had hung and came to rest on the floor. Blood was everywhere. Blood droplets on the floor had dried hours ago. To the right of the front entrance, the base of the stairs, lay the body of Peter Porco. His eyes were wide open, his shirt stuck halfway up his chest. His arm reached above his head as if he had struggled to pull himself up the stairs. Peter's forehead had taken the brunt of the attack. It looked as if someone had slashed him deeply using a very large knife. Hart held onto his gun in his right hand, cell phone in his left. "This is a crime scene. Call an ambulance. Peter's not breathing," he shouted into the phone. Costello quickly complied. Hart heard a beeping sound coming from another room. Carefully scanning for any movement that might tell him the killer was inside, he found a cordless phone charger, that is, by the slider. It was disconnected from the house phone Hart had tried to call earlier. Through the cell, Costello told him to leave the house immediately. And thus began one of the more brutal cases. So with that, any questions? Yes?
How did you receive permission to write about it?
Well, you don't need permission. Obviously, it may not make some people happy that it's been written, but it is a public case. It's out in the public domain. One of the reasons I did write it was because this does have an impact on the public. This was a case that was tried far away from me, who had to go down to Goshen, 3 hours south, which made this basically a very expensive case. I have the figure in the end of the book, and I forget the figure offhand. It was several $100,000 is what it costs Albany County, and that's your tax money. So essentially, you have a right to know what happened with this case. Was it prosecuted correctly? Was the defense doing a good job of presenting their client well, when at first it was thought maybe because there wasn't much money there left, that maybe this was through your tax dollars as well, which is not the case. But all these questions come up, and so I mean, this is something that people have the right to know about, to judge, and figure out if their tax money is working well, among other issues. Sure.
Remember the question the minister asked? Do you mind answering it now?
That's the best question I could ask. It's funny. I guess the best way to word it is there's so much circumstantial evidence here. Now, I don't want to say that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I have seen Shawshank Redemption as well. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that movie where, a set of bizarre circumstances made it look like he was the one who did it. So am I saying there's a shred of doubt there? For some people, certainly. For myself, it honestly fluctuates daily. I'll say, well, he obviously did it. But then in the next day I'll think, but I don't know. So I wish I could give you a good answer. As a good journalist, I should say, I'm still covering this case, so I have no opinion. But I don't know if people really, don't have no opinions in their lives. So the honest answer is probably what I said to Mike McDermott as he walked in to basically talk about it, make his final arguments during this case. And I said, is he the most guilty man you have ever seen, or is he just the unluckiest? And he actually used that, and a lot of prosecutors like to use that line. I thought that was a pretty good line, but apparently they use it all the time. And he actually then used it, so I was, oh gosh, he used my line. Well, it really wasn't my line. And I think that about sums it up, though. And so is there a little doubt in my head? Certainly. And that's why I think I can fairly report on this, because I think there is some room to wonder. But does that mean that he didn't do it? I don't know. Is that a fair answer? That's the best I can answer it. Yes.
Yes. You said that you heard from some Marines in North Carolina whose opinion was that he could not have possibly done it.
Mm-hmm.
Did they tell you their reasons why? Because I'm convinced myself that he did do it, because I followed it very closely, and his lifestyle just was
so basically,
a big lie.
For anyone who can't hear, basically saying that how did those Marines come to the conclusion that he couldn't have done it when you think that he likely did it? And it's funny. It's what it is. I think it gets down to reasonable doubt. And what is reasonable doubt? For them, it's the circumstantial evidence. There's nothing that ties it. And for them, it's where did all the bloody clothes, there had to be bloody clothes. Where did that go? They never found it. And there was no blood in the Jeep. So while they may have put the Jeep at the scene that day, there was not a trace of blood. There was one spot of blood that was found in that Jeep. It might have been under the console or under the, I'd have to actually go back and read my own book to remember, but it was an old blood stain. So for them, and for a number of people, there's questions like that rise to the level where they say, well, wait a minute, did he really do it then if we didn't find what would likely be bloody clothes and this Jeep really had no trace of anything? And the answer to that, of course, the prosecution would say during the case was that this was a man who was familiar with cleaning up bloody messes because he worked at the vet's office. So he would know how to clean that up, but that's a theory, not necessarily a fact. So that was some of the thinking in terms of those Marines. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Did you interview Terry Kinlan?
Yes, often. I interview Terry Kinlan often. Yes.
Okay. And the second thing is, I think we all watch too much television. We think everything's going to be cut and dried, if you're part of the pun, in an hour, and it's not. It's not that easy.
Yeah. So you're saying that.
Well, the fact, you can't tie up all the loose ends. There's no blood in the Jeep.
Yes.
So there's no clothes. So that doesn't mean that they don't exist somewhere in a landfill.
That's true. And it's a good point, because I think one of the things about this trial, often trials happen, cases happen, we hear the headlines. Okay, this person's arrested, and then maybe a little later on, they're either found not guilty or guilty. and we never really follow the in-between. And that's what this case allowed us as reporters, but also us as the larger Capital Region society to follow, because so many people follow this. And it provided a window into the legal system that we don't often see, except for on, maybe CSI or Boston Legal or, some of these shows, which of course are TV shows and perhaps not too close to reality. I don't know, I don't watch them. So I think it's a very good point, because then you get to see it's not clear. There's no clear line of, well, did you do it or did you not do it? And those jurors have a very, very difficult time. I have respect for anyone who's on a jury of such a such a serious crime, because there's never, except for perhaps one case that I've seen, just overwhelming absolute evidence where it's oh, this is easy. And I think that's perhaps part of a misconception. So I think that's a really good point. Yes, ma'am.
You described the discovery of his body. How about her? How was she discovered?
Yes, that's, as this continues, absolutely. That's one of the next parts. The, police, the EMTs, the police come in, clear the house, of course, making sure that there's no one inside who, no assailant. And from that point, they get the EMTs up there as they find this person laying on the bed lengthwise.
And that's upstairs?
Upstairs, yep, upstairs in the bedroom. Basically passed out, but the detectives say, she is kind of responding to their questions. And, and that's the thing. Then you get into the legal questions about that. And, was she responding? Was it meaningless response? And, I think you could find a number of people on either side of that debate who would say, give you one or the other sides that, oh, she was shaking her head yes, she seemed to be moving her finger, that yes, it was Christopher Porco who did this. Moving both at the same time would be something that a speech therapist would likely do, knowing that, maybe their head isn't nodding, but doing a finger up and down would help you make that clear to people, perhaps because you are not going to survive. And yet there's others who say, she had no memory of the attack, obviously had such awful damage that how could anybody really understand what was going on in the questions asked? And that was a main defense argument throughout the case, which was fascinating to me. And I'll say, my wife is a speech therapist too, so I was able to ask her a lot of these questions. And she was saying that you are taught to, a number of ways to communicate all these aspects. But the defense, and this is what my wife also spoke about, was saying the police never asked basically a basic question like, are you Joan Porco? Is this 2004? Basic questions to establish that the other questions were legit. And the prosecution basically said, hey, they didn't have much time. This was a woman who could have died at any second. She had to get medical help. They just wanted to ask the questions and get her out. Again, getting back to the fact that life isn't simple. Yes?
Is it true the jury only wanted the one readback of the Time Warner cable? Is that the key piece of evidence with the master?
Yes, and it's funny because we could talk about that nod. Yes, I'm sorry. I've already broken the rule that we set. He wanted to know, was there just the one readback by the jurors before they made their decision to convict Christopher Porco? That one readback was in regards to the Time Warner cable security system. And that is it. That's all they looked at as far as the readback again. What's interesting about that is, and they subsequently spoke on, I'm sure some of you have seen the 48-hour special, where they said, that head nod, which we were just talking about from Joan Porco, didn't really make their minds up for them. That in fact, it was this timeline the prosecutors had set up where no one saw that Christopher Porco in the lounge at the University of Rochester when he at first said he was, even though that supposed confession, the interrogation, was thrown out. And therefore, there was plenty of debate about that as well. Do you use that evidence, I guess if you call it evidence, because it was thrown out, deemed he wasn't read his rights or didn't have his attorney there. So can you then investigate based on something that was tossed out of the trial? All these, fascinating legal arguments. And the prosecution would say that no, they didn't. They would have investigated and found all these things. Anyway, but all the circumstantial evidence, whether it's, no one seeing him in the lounge. Of course, these were a bunch of college students who had been drinking and didn't seem to have a memory too well of the night anyway. And then there's the toll booth ticket that they said corresponded to the car at the right time, going from the right toll booths, and kind of going from there, as well as the neighbor seeing the Jeep in the driveway, the neighbor who really didn't know what was going on at the time when he was asked, apparently. So you've got all of those pieces of evidence, and that Time Warner Cable security system was that key piece that put a time on when the phone line in the back of the yard would have been cut, as well as when the security system was, smashed. But not the main part that kept the memory of what happened. And so as a result, you essentially have a key piece at the house putting down some main timeline, keeping that timeline that corresponds with everything, and works pretty well with the trip from Rochester University. So that was a key piece for the jurors. I saw your hand back there.
Could she have been nodding for them to call her son since she knew what happened?
And that's something the defense absolutely said. They said, how do you know that, I'm sorry, I'll repeat the question. Don't you, I get passionate about answering the questions right off. The question was, basically, how do you know Joan Porco wasn't nodding to say, call my son, or, get help, or something else? And again, that's something the defense brought up. That's one of the things they clearly said to jurors. There is no way to know that she was nodding her head, saying, oh, Chris, my son Chris. Yes, get him, please. She couldn't speak. And so there's, that incident is very much up to interpretation. And that's one of the things the defense said. Yes, follow up for you.
The officer that went there to the house, didn't he die about a month or maybe a couple weeks after that happened of a heart attack? And did he have a previous heart condition?
Interesting. This is a question about a police officer who had gone to the house who later passed away. And it is true, I believe there were 2 police officers who have since passed away who heavily investigated this case. And again, such a bizarre set of circumstances that I talk about in the book, where the defense was making accusations that very much angered the Bethlehem Police Department, because they said they were baseless accusations, that these police did a good job, and you don't need to discredit the name of these police officers who have done nothing but a service to their community. That being said, the defense basically accused one or more of these officers of basically investigating Christopher Porco and forget the rest of the evidence. And a couple of months later, one of the police officers dies, and then another one passes away. And what was interesting about that too was one of Terry Kinlan, the defense attorney, one of his attorneys, one of his main attorneys, who I've actually met and worked with on other cases, was, I believe, jogging or coming home from piano practice with his daughter, and he saw someone laying in the street. And he lives near this police officer, and apparently was the one who called 911 and the police officer later passed away. So this was a very controversial part of this, because the defense basically said, well, now that this man has passed away, we can't be sure that this evidence is legit. That's a chain of custody issue. In other words, we don't know if this piece of evidence that was picked up at the house over here, that was handled by this police officer at point B, if it's legit at point C anymore. Now, nothing really came of it. They said, no, everything's been accounted for and all that, but that's what the defense tried to raise. And there was also some issues. They said that, the police officer, may have had it out for Christopher because of some relationship with the police officer's daughter and Christopher, but that was never really figured out. It was a lot of innuendo and accusation, and yet I'm not sure if it's not untrue. So a lot of one more quickly, and I've got to get to those other.
There was a thumbprint or a fingerprint on the box outside the house,
yes.
A power box. Did they ever establish whose fingerprint it was?
The fingerprint outside on the back of the phone box or electric box that was on the telephone pole. Did they ever establish whose that was? And this is an interesting part that you only learn by sitting in these trials, that you don't learn from watching TV and CSI and all those cool shows, is that the experts will tell you only about 5% of fingerprints are able to be matched with anybody. The rest are too degraded, or they don't really have a way to match it up, or maybe they can exclude people, but they still don't know who it is. They can say, well, that's not this person's, or that's not yours, and that's not yours, but we're still not sure who it is. So there's a number of ways you can get to that, but it was too degraded. They couldn't tell whose it was, whether it was there for months, weeks, or just a couple of days, or hours. They don't know. Yes, sir.
This is a loose ends question. Somewhere in your book you mentioned that, or you gave the impression that Porco had an independent income, that he was involved in some business.
This is Christopher Porco?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you ever learn what that business was, or what?
It's a great question. The question is, did Christopher Porco sort of have some way of making money on the side? He sort of had some business that he may have been going on. And why it's a great question is because there's been a lot of rumors and such spread about this question. Among the rumors that maybe he had some gambling debts or other issues, and that might have even drove him to try to claim the money from his parents and all that. That was never proven. But what he did, according to a number of police officers who I've spoken with, who investigated this case, state police officers, as well as local folks, saying that he had a number of ways he would do it. It was, I don't know if you've heard of the eBay, all that he was selling on eBay, which was a number of computers. And that was reported, but it may have been more extensive than what we even learned about at the trial. In other words, one of the ways he may have been trying to make money was to take these computers wherever he got them from, whether it was his family or even at the University of Rochester. A number of people said they just couldn't quite prove that it was him, but there were a number of computers that may have been stolen from the University of Rochester at some point too. There were also computers, or at least filings on eBay, apparently according to these officials, that they say there were a number of computers that didn't really exist, but they were for sale on eBay. So it was basically a big scam, they think, that started to come crashing down when all his credit card debts and everything else became, started to add up, and that's what they think drove him to do it. So I hope that answers your question. It is fascinating, though, that one of the symbols for this trial really became that yellow Jeep. And I remember after the jury decided that he was guilty, and I was live for, what seems like hours talking about this and telling people what had happened and describing the scene, which was one of the craziest I've ever. People were running out of the courtroom screaming, crying, those who knew Christopher, who were friends with him. Others crying because, justice, but is it really closure? And it was so dramatic, and yet after all of this, a couple hours later, all of us reporters were sitting in this parking lot we'd been in for months now. The whole parking lot was empty, this large parking lot. And the last thing that was left was just that yellow Jeep sitting right in the center. And it was really just kind of bizarre. Someone, a friend of the family, I guess, came and later picked it up. But and since then, the yellow Jeep has actually been sold. Someone, I think, in another state owns it now, but I couldn't really trace it. I tried. Yes, sir.
Two things. One is, what are your thoughts about the degree of violence? That's one of the things that struck me. And the other thing, the relationship between the two brothers. They were estranged, were they not?
Yeah, good questions. The first was just comment about the level of violence and what that might mean. And I would only say that, I think the conclusion from the prosecution was that this level of violence would really only indicate that this was a crime of rage, of passion, of just pure anger or hatred, trying to send a message, something along those lines, which is why they thought that might indicate that this was a family member or someone who obviously knew them. I don't know. One thing that was interesting, it was found that he had a pellet gun, some sort of pellet gun in the back of his Jeep. And they never really paid that much attention. They said, well, he's a kid, he has a pellet gun. But, there have been theories, and people have talked to me and said, well, after reading that, maybe he meant to do it with that or something, and then, he found the axe and that was better. I don't know. It's up for interpretation. And the other question you had was a quick little second.
Two brothers estranged.
Two brothers estranged, yeah. One of the most interesting parts, and this, I think, was a turning point for the trial when the jurors saw Christopher Porco's brother, who was not perhaps going to testify because he's in that nuclear submarine, which is a classified location. So they had enough people basically testifying so that way he wouldn't have to show up and testify that he wasn't there, he couldn't have committed the crime. The brother walked in, and it was just silence. I have never really experienced anything like it. And he walked up. You could tell he had some military training with how he walked. He sat down, and he just refused to look at his brother. And that was very, very telling for many people have said, and I just heard you say that. One of the interesting things, the defense attorney came over to Christopher, and he was sitting and kept trying to kind of inch over, get him to look at him, and he still wouldn't. So it was really, really fascinating. I mean, what does that say? Who knows? I mean, he wasn't there, he said, so I don't know. But another thing to mention too, his brother, who I tried to reach out to, believes this is just a family matter and really, shouldn't have been reported as it was. And, obviously I have my difference because it is a public case, but I certainly understand, and if it were my family, I would probably feel just as he does. So it's sort of a conundrum there. But he didn't want to speak at all, and it was obviously, understandably, impossibly tough for him. I saw your hand. All right, for anybody, basically a number of topics being raised here. I think the most interesting one is that Peter Porco wandered around in the downstairs, before he essentially passed out and died in the downstairs area, which is where we found him during that reading. And that is true. Prosecutors and police at first thought they had a scene of a struggle at this house, and that was something that over time they had to realize. They found out where the blood spots were and who they were from, and they realized that this was Peter basically going about his morning routine, obviously oblivious to what he had gone through, perhaps. That's the theory. And one of the more interesting aspects of it was, what does that mean? Because they found a check to, I believe, the Saratoga County clerk or something like that for basically paying Christopher Porco's parking ticket in Saratoga. And that was left on the dishwasher. There were some blood spots under the door of the dishwasher. And so in other words, he would have had to have opened the door, pulled out the rack, and put the check on there. And the prosecutors had a very interesting line. I think it was Mike McDermott who said, well, that was his father trying to show, or it was Terry Kinlan who had the interesting line, but it was McDermott said, well, it was trying to show who did it, and then Terry Kinlan said, that was just his father loving his son and just trying to clean up his mess. You can decide which way to take it, but it's fascinating, and really, it kind of. That was a tough day in court when they talked about that evidence, and some of the jurors, I believe it was that day, started to get even emotional. There was a tissue box that was passed around on a number of days, because it really kind of came home, the tragedy of this, and knowing that there was a cell phone that was out on the kitchen table the whole time, that was never called, and if he had gotten the help, you wonder, maybe he could have survived, and we'll never know. And so that was a tough day in court hearing that. Yes?
Is he going to get his appeal?
Is he going to get his appeal? That's a good question. I've read through the appeal. It's about 100-something pages. And it's very much based on the issues that we've been talking about, that head nod. Should that have been let in? And did that taint the jury because of what it means for the legal process? Because you're not dealing with you're now dealing with quote-unquote direct evidence. If the jury decides that head nod may be direct evidence, then that means the judge gave jurors a different set of instructions than he would have otherwise given them had there been no head nod issue. And so it brings up all these kind of obscure but to me fascinating legal arguments as well. Did a lot of the investigation, as I sort of mentioned before, come from that taped interrogation of Christopher Porco, which was thrown out because of certain problems with Miranda rights, his attorney not being let in. And yet, does the appeal perhaps stand up stronger because some of these things weren't let in before or not? So it's fascinating. We're going to have to see. I think both attorneys, you've got Terry Kinlan on one side and you've got prosecutors, I've spoken with both of them and both acknowledge it's a long shot. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And this is a case that in many ways broke new ground. So some of these issues really potentially could go up a few court levels to be decided. Yes, sir.
If the appeal is granted, does some of that evidence get to be used that they threw out before?
Well, if the appeal is granted, the question is, if the appeal gets granted, basically what happens is that then they go to a whole new trial.
The evidence that was thrown out before be used?
They would have to have hearings all over again, likely, to decide what evidence would go in and out. And this would basically start anew to try to give Christopher Porco as fair a trial as possible. Follow-up, yes.
Also on the axe. Where did the axe come from?
Where did the axe come? The axe came from the garage.
Was the garage locked before?
But you could access it. You could access the garage from the inside, and the outside of the garage was locked. So they think that's how that
Who knew it
happened.
was there besides? Who knew it was there?
Who knew it was there? Yeah, it's a good question. And the prosecutors believe that it was Christopher Porco who knew where it was. Did Christopher Porco show any emotion?
During the trial.
That's a good question. You know, a lot of people have commented on how he was emotionless. He didn't show any emotion, and I wouldn't say that that's true. Yeah, Christopher Porco, I mean, he cried quite a bit on some of the more emotional days. He did.
Yeah, I was wondering about
Yeah, that doesn't mean, I mean, you know, some people have said the behavior when he was being interrogated was, you know, how could you be so stoic? And there's certainly questions there. And, you know, after it was 2 years later when the trial happened, so, you know, it's his attorney said, and I thought this was an interesting point, was, you know, you sort of want to see somebody cry, but then if he cries, is he just faking it? And if he doesn't cry, then he doesn't feel for his parents. So either way, he's kind of in trouble. So it's tough to read into that. But he cried at several points, and, you know, what he was thinking, of course, is anybody's guess. Yes, ma'am.
I think I missed your answer when the previous woman or someone over here asked, when Mrs. Porco was asked, did Christopher do it? Was she also asked, did Jonathan do it? And she said no? I didn't get that.
Oh, the head nod, yes.
Did she? Was she asked about Jonathan?
Yeah, what did she say about Jonathan versus Christopher during the head nod? She, according to the detectives, and the problem with this is some of the detectives, their stories vary a little bit in the EMTs, and one of them even says that he asked the question when the other police officer said, no, he asked the question. So there is some variation, but then again, this was a frantic scene, and obviously that could probably be easily understood. The question was asked twice, each one. Did Christopher do this to you? And she seemed to indicate yes, according to the detectives. Did Jonathan do this to you? No. And both times she seemed to do that. The defense would say that, well, prosecutors these investigators were trying to pin somebody down. They knew that Christopher was they knew of him before perhaps, and so we're trying to indicate that this was, basically a setup from the start. So I'm trying to get someone who I haven't, yes.
Thank you. I'm curious about, hadn't Christopher approached his parents at some point and asked for money for some of his debts, and he was refused? And some people had heard that Peter, I guess, had said that he wasn't going to give any money. I don't remember the whole thing, but there was something about being approached for the money in desperation.
Well, I'll tell you, I have a number of emails in this book, and I think that explains it the best. I can't go through them because they're mixed in, but there's a number of times where, you know, he has a credit card or a mobile speed pass and these sort of things that can keep buying him stuff, and, you know, suddenly his card's missing, but it's been charged with all this junk food and stuff. So he definitely had access to money the whole time, and then would say, well, it's not someone stole it. But hey, if you can send me some money, that'd be great. You know, sort of that thing. So, I mean,
It wasn't in desperation. Somewhere I got the impression that he needed money desperately, and he had approached his parents, and they had refused him maybe the first time.
this is a question of did he approach his parents and try to gain, get money in desperation. I mean, yes, there were some conversations that they obviously had. And those conversations were where his father wanted to basically set down the law, it sounded like from these emails, where he wanted to say, look, I'll pay off this, I'll do that, but you need to take responsibility. And that's sort of kind of where it was left. I mean, approaching him going, hey, here's my problem, Dad. I got $1 million in debt. And it wasn't like that, but it was, a dialogue between a father and a son who's away at college and spending things that maybe he shouldn't be, and a father who's frustrated because he's paying all this money for college. And it was sort of that kind of dialogue. So desperation, I don't know. I'd let you be the judge of that.
That was my feeling.
Yeah, and it could very well be. I mean, things were coming to a head, though, you could tell with these emails. There's a lot more exclamation points in some of these emails as time goes on. And then there's that final email, which a lot of people, because I don't analyze it, I don't tell you that this email is sent the day after, but that email the day after this all happens is, hey, Dad, how you doing? Everything's good. Hope to see you. Yes, that's from. Yes, you in the back did forge his name on a number of applications, and there was some confusion over which semester was being paid for at the University of Rochester based on the money that was happening, because his dad thought that, I think, the previous semester was being paid for, and then, or the future one was being paid for, but then Christopher was really just taking that money to pay for the current one. And so there was a problem, and the total of debt that he had amounted. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm bad with numbers. That's why I became a journalist, I think. But it got quite up there, in the tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars, which is quite significant. So Christopher did tell his parents at that point that he was getting a free semester, and so that's why father didn't need to worry. So there was that. Yes, ma'am.
Didn't Peter make the comment to someone that he felt his son was a sociopath?
Yes.
Or was that in an email or to someone verbally?
That was testified to by a coworker of Peter Porco's down at the trial, and that was a very interesting moment at the trial as well. The back and forth, I wish I could recreate it here to explain it to you well, but basically the coworker said that at some point, and she almost didn't want to say it because it was tough. You could tell that she obviously had her own opinions about things, and she didn't want to come out and say, something that she knew the impact of it would be, no matter what she believed, I guess I should say. And yeah, she said that at one point, Peter, with this whole money situation, they're going back and forth, there was something that happened where he said, kind of out of exasperation, my son is a sociopath. There's some debate, of course, about that. Of course, the defense was trying to say, well, you get so exasperated with somebody, you love your son, maybe you'd say something like that. I'll let you all be the judge of that. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you know how Joan Porco is doing and whether she visits Christopher in prison.
Yes, how is Joan Porco doing? That's a good question. And I should say that I haven't spoken with her. It's tough to get a hold of her, and I want to respect her as well. And I don't think she wants to relive this every day of her life. So I've reached out, but her folks haven't reached out back to me, so I respect that. But she is currently back in the Capital Region, as far as I know. And she's apparently, by all accounts, I hear little bits from people who know her and all that she's doing better. She feels as good as she could and is trying to be active. She's been at conferences for speech language pathologists, and is trying to be active. And she does visit Christopher, according to a number of people who up at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. And that she still stands by him, and that's one of the main visitors. I'm not sure if he has any other, but that's the one that I hear about. So, yes.
I was wondering if she has a relationship with Jonathan based on his feelings towards his brother.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'll be honest with you. Does Joan Porco have a relationship with Jonathan Porco, and what is that now? Since he seemed, the assumption is that he thinks that Christopher did it. And I don't know the answer because the family dynamics was very tough to get a hold of and a grasp of, because some people just didn't really want to talk about it at all or don't want anything to do with it, understandably. Other people, Christopher did this, he should get justice, but this is my Christopher. And then there's the other people who say, no, he couldn't have done this. So in all those dynamics and how that works out, that's tough. And I don't think if it was in my family, I would even understand those dynamics. Yes.
How is Christopher doing in prison? Is he in isolation, or how is he managing?
Yeah, he. I don't know if he's in isolation or anything like that. I know that up there, I believe it's something like 22 or 23 hours out of the day, he's pretty much by himself. So if that's isolation, then pretty much. That's what he's doing. He reads a lot, according to some of the people I've talked with. He reads. He obviously was working quite a bit on his appeal, and he was working with Terry Kinlan and that law firm on that, writing up parts, annotating it, and then sending it back, and then they'd make changes and send it back to him. So that's sort of where things are at. And I haven't been in touch with him recently, but in the past, he said he looks forward to an appeal, and hopes to get out because he didn't commit this crime.
Two questions. He knows about your book, then?
I would guess he does.
The other question is, his aunt and uncle who lived in Rochester. And I haven't read too thoroughly about the case, but I think it was proven that he lied about some involvement that he'd had with them, that he was supposed to be working for them and doing things.
Yeah, the question of
really done it.
some of the testimony that in regards to did he lie about what he was supposed to be doing with his uncle and aunt that day when all of this went down? And the answer to that is, according to them, or according to students, I should say, and not according to the uncle and aunt, because they said they knew nothing about it, he was going with his uncle and aunt to mulch that day. Yes.
Why wasn't Christopher put on the stand and testify on his own behalf?
Why wouldn't Christopher testify for himself is the question. That is, I asked Terry Kinlan that himself. And he said that's the $1 million question. If you get paid $1 million for a case, which he tells me that he did not for this case, but he says that it's $1 to take the case and do all the work, and $999,999 to decide whether your client takes the stand. And I think in this case there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that the prosecution would have had to have brought in, or that they brought in, that Christopher would have had to have explained, which, let's say he didn't do it. If there was that amount of evidence against me, I certainly wouldn't want to testify, because those lawyers are really smart and they'd make me say something that probably wasn't good. So that's, the beauty of the law system is you don't have to. They have to prove your case. Now, granted, does that lead to a little frustration for a lifetime, perhaps, for Christopher, who couldn't make his case, and let's say he is innocent? That's a tough call. But I think there was, when you have a lot of certain types of evidence, you certainly wouldn't want to put your client up there when you can essentially try to paint him as a liar. So, yes, ma'am. Great question. The question is, as a reporter, did you feel like it was tough to remain objective, that you had some relationships forming, and with all the drama and emotion of the case, essentially, how does that all play out? Is that your question? Is that fair? And the answer is, I had so many questions and there were so many details throughout this case that it wasn't until afterwards that I could sort of put it together in my own head. So when you feel like you have all the puzzle pieces, but you still can't see the picture, I think it's very easy to remain objective. And even now, I think there are questions that I still have answers to. Some of them I've raised here. Where are those bloody clothes? And perhaps things we'll never have answers to, and maybe that's irrelevant too. I don't know. But with the emotion and trying to remain unbiased, especially when you're talking with people day in, day out, I think there's a fine line. I like to get along with as many people as I can and try to respect everyone I can. That doesn't mean I have to agree with them or not agree with them. In fact, that's a call that I just don't make as I'm doing it, or try not to make. So in other words, Terry Kinlan, a lot of people have criticized him for some of the things that he said, but I certainly respect him because he is a very, very intelligent man. Mike McDermott, same deal, and David Rossi, and all these folks who have this, there's certain things that all people say. I'm sure there's things I've said today that maybe people say, ooh, I don't know why he said that, and that's really kind of awkward. But, you can still kind of respect someone for their work and work from that standpoint. And that's what I try to do. I mean, David Rossi, for instance, or Mike McDermott, someone on the prosecution once was trying to say that, this crime happened in November, and that's like these other crimes that Christopher Porco may have done at the home. So that means that he was guilty, could have been guilty. And that to me was kind of a stretch too. So, it's you realize that everyone's doing their best job, and it's my job to try to decipher and just tell the story. And that allows me to take a step back. Plus, with the camera right here, it's a little easier to take a step back. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my best attempt. Okay, I'm trying to ask anyone who I haven't called on.
I'm not sure where your story ends, but do you plan on a follow-up?
She's not sure where my story ends, but do I need to do a follow-up, especially with the appeal and the other stuff that could happen? And the answer to that is I'm kind of waiting and seeing actually right now because depending on what happens with this appeal, I mean, if it doesn't go through, I've just got a couple pages to add. If it does go through, it's going to be a lot of work. But I think it's important. I think it's important to tell the story, a story that so many people have cared about, a story that really has educated so many people, including myself, about the legal process and many legal questions. So I think that's important. So I will try to do it justice as best I can. Does that mean it's a big follow-up or this or that? I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where it goes, and we'll see if Christopher's willing to talk with me at some point as well. There's been some indications of that, and I hope that's the case because I think he's got a story to tell. And I would love to have him be able to tell it. So we'll see. We'll see what we get. It's a good question. You had a question. Mafia connection is fascinating, and that is actually the answer to that is one of the only days that I missed the trial, and I think that's because it was on a Friday, and that was my wedding weekend. This was fascinating. Fascinating theory, though, was that Peter Porco had basically a cousin down in New York City who was involved with the mob, who was put away for loan sharking and some other kind of vague crimes. And so because of the vague crimes and the fact that he didn't go away as long as perhaps the defense thought he should have for those crimes, they said, wait a minute, he cut a deal with the feds, somebody knew that, and then they paid him back by attacking his cousin upstate. And so that was one of the theories. But one of the investigators, the state police, said he talked with the fireman, Frankie the fireman Porco as he's known, and he said he just laughed at him and said, I've got nothing to do with this. That being said, that theory is not saying that Frankie the fireman has anything to do with it. So it's kind of up to interpretation. Do you think that it could have been some guys getting back at him? That's what the defense, one of the defense theories. I mean, the defense raised a number of theories, and some people have said, well, how many theories do you have to raise, to show that something else happened, and not all of these could have happened. So there's been criticism on either side. I mean, even saying that Joan Porco saw a stranger in the driveway in the months leading up to this, and that concerned her a little bit. So, again, it's all you read into it. In the front row. Yes.
I have a question about the book. Leaving the Marines aside, did anyone in Missouri or California read this who aren't based locally? Did they sway one way or the other whether they thought he was guilty or not?
Great question. That people who have read this, basically out of the area, what do they think? People who are not, weren't reading the newspaper every day and weren't tainted perhaps by, everyone's opinion as everyone talked about it. And the answer is, I would say it's about 50-50. Maybe a few more saying that they thought he was guilty, but it really surprised me actually because I didn't know what to expect. And I think most people are just simply able to draw their own conclusions. That being said, I think that it breaks down in three ways. One of them is people who say, no way he could have done it. Done. End of story. There's the other people who say, absolutely, he did it, he's guilty, should go to jail the rest of his life. And then there's the people who say, he probably did it, but I couldn't have convicted him. So there's sort of your three lines that I've heard as a result of the book. Yes?
I'm just wondering, who's paying Terry Kinlan? Because that whole thing must be, I don't think Porco said that kind of money.
Who's paying Terry Kinlan? I've asked him that many times, he won't tell me. I think part of it is probably from the sale of the house, people imagine. There's probably some money there, that Joan had, et cetera. Those are some of the ideas. But to be honest with you, I don't think anyone's really been able to nail it down. It's sort of a touchy thing. And where does money come from in the future for the appeal? I don't know. Perhaps it's more pro bono than we think. I don't know.
When the police were questioning Joan Porco, how did they know the two sons' names? In other words, did Jonathan do it? Did Christopher do it?
Yeah, they and I covered that in the book, where basically, how did they know it was Jonathan and Christopher when they first interrogated her? And the answer to that is, a couple of them didn't at first. Some of the officers may have known from the previous times of being at the house, but they couldn't really remember the names or one of the names, so they called back to the station and they kind of figured it out because they'd been to the house, and they sort of figured it out from there. So.
And whose key was in the front door? Yeah, did you talk about
It was their own key. It was the key that was from the flower pot. Where did the key in the door? Where did that come from? It was basically, the lockout key. If I lock myself out of my house, a lot of people have a hideaway key. They had one in the flower pot, and so it was. They think the theory is that it was Peter Porco letting himself back in after he'd gone to get the newspaper. And that's where those blood spots that were in my reading came from.
So the murder itself must have been early in the morning.
Very early in the morning. Thank you. This is it was a wonderful turnout, and it's always a great debate, great discussion, so thank you.